This is me. Or rather, it was for a while. For about 18 months, from 2015 to 2017, I was part of Champaign Ladies Amateur Wrestling, a performance group in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. My name was Virginia Dentata. Claw was born in the basements and backyards of a collective of local women, some friends, some acquaintances, all interested in pushing boundaries and disrupting feminine norms. I myself, however, am not a founding member. I had the opportunity to join through a friend of a friend, but I turned it down flat. Not only am I not much of an athlete, but the whole thing seemed pretty male-gazy to me. As it turned out, I was wrong. In this video, I argue that Claw turned its wrestling into feminist activism by both embracing and monstrifying tropes about women's bodies and spectacle. Using my own experience as an entry point, I explore how grotesquerie and transgression are used to create arguments, but also how they are not always sufficient on their own. Although hit Netflix series Glow is set in the 1980s, the birth of women's pro wrestling predates it by at least a century. According to Dan Murphy, author of Sisters of the Squared Circle, The History and Rise of Women's Wrestling, women began wrestling as a crowd-pleasing spectacle around the same time men did, as novelty acts in late 19th century carnivals. In the 30s and 40s, which Murphy characterizes as the golden age of women's wrestling, wrestlers like Mildred Burke became international globe-trotting celebrities, known not for their pretty faces, but their flashy acrobatic moves in the ring. By the 1990s, however, women's role in wrestling had turned salacious, with so-called bra and panty matches replacing previous decades' athleticism. In present times, the pendulum has swung again, and women's professional wrestling is, Murphy says, as respected as men's. Women wrestling has always been a subversion of women's traditional roles, but at the same time, it has always been a spectacle, with skimpy outfits and occasionally mud. Claw embraces the spectacle, with outlandish look-at-me characters and surprisingly ambitious choreography, but it also undermines the gaze. Through exaggeration and grotesquerie, the wrestlers of Claw perform a monstrous femininity that, in the words of J. Dolmage, embodies heretical rhetorical acts. Some take on traditional roles for women, librarian, baker, aerobics instructor, and amplify their characteristics to disruptive levels. Others make their exaggeration physical. For instance, Feral Hannah is one of our most athletic wrestlers, in by far the skimpiest outfit. But before each public appearance, she sprays her legs and bikini line with adhesive and covers them in clots of hair, intentionally undercutting traditional feminine appeal. And then there's me. I conceptualized Virginia while smiling my face off in the crowd at Claw's first public performance. Delighted by the campy and resolutely non-objectifying tone of the show, I wanted to see how far I could run with it. In the lead-up to her matches, Virginia is prissy and proper, never acknowledging and seemingly unaware of her unusual charms. I chose this approach because in some ways it felt more audacious, looking people in the eye and daring them to say something. My eyes are up here. It's powerful. It's how I imagine I might feel if my breasts had bear traps. Virginia is, quoting Dolmage again, monstrously bodied, discursively excessive, and thus corporeally oversignificant. The wrong parts of her take up too much space, and she won't even acknowledge your discomfort, much less apologize for it. When doing show promotions in downtown bars, I was wildly popular for photo ops, but people often didn't know what to do with their hands. In discussing contemporary activist strategies, Kristen Marie Bivens and Kirsty Cole point toward what they call grotesque protest, the phenomenon of using bodily fluids and tissues to emphasize resistance to political movements attempting to control and legislate bodies. These protests, like the Periods for Pence exhortation to male politicians use menstrual products in the face of legislation criminalizing miscarriage, capitalize on societal depictions of bodies and bodily fluids as grotesque, vulgar, and taboo. Virginia and other wrestlers did involve bodily fluids. The milkmaid, the lactating mother of a newborn, rigged a contraption in her bra to finish her opponents by spraying them with faux breast milk. And in her final match, Virginia vanquished Feral Hannah with the help of tampon nunchucks. Such gross-out choices are not as pointed, perhaps, as periods for Pence. But we live in a world where breastfeeding mothers are still kicked out of restaurants, and where art from a well-known poet is removed from Facebook for faux period blood. Even in pantomime, there is a power to putting these acts on a stage and demanding everyone should look. My final show with Claw was a fundraiser for our local rape crisis center, which had been hamstrung by a state budget impasse and forced to dramatically scale back its services. It felt right for many reasons. My first show with Claw sold out a 400-person performance venue. The next one, at a larger venue, sold even more tickets. But with increasing popularity came increasing professionalization, harder moves, better branding, more polish on something whose original appeal had been its rough edges. Claw was making money, but things were getting less DIY and more LLC. Using our ticket sales to support vulnerable members of our community returned us to our grassroots beginnings, a model that Claw continues to follow today. And then, of course, there was Trump. With a president who not only bragged about helping himself to women's bodies, but also judged their acceptability according to his own narrow taste, using bodily grotesquerie to raise money for races felt doubly urgent. With old Mr. Grab Her by the in charge, even putting my costume on felt like a political statement, or more accurately, a political imperative. I was now weaponized, a loaded symbol ready to go off. It turned out I'd been Chekhov's vagina all along. Because of the rhetorical choice of my monstrous body, simply getting on stage and kegling someone into submission was no longer enough. I felt more like an exigence than an argument. And so Feral Hannah and I arranged for an impersonator in a blonde wig and red tie. We shouted our values at him. Science is real. Consent is mandatory. Freedom of religion means all religions. Black lives matter. It does not say RSVP on the Statue of Liberty. We threw him around and hurled our unruly bodies against him. Feral whirled herself around his neck and used her furry legs to bring him down. We tried to think of an appropriate move for me, chewing him up, smothering him. But in the end, we decided that the most powerful argument that my body could make was this: to never let him touch my costume at all. The monstrous femininity that Claw facilitates is an important form of protest, particularly now. To be deliberately grotesque is to push back on bodily control, and the excesses of Claw allow both participants and audiences to act out in cathartic ways. Its boisterous grotesqueries destabilize norms, embracing spectacle while rejecting objectification. Its rhetorical bodies have teeth.